while I've been at Moore's, listening to you people complain about the heat and the humidity at Quantico, this is what I've been missing back in Phoenix. When I moved here in 2010, it was, my understanding, the hottest, driest major city in America. This is what I expected. But I think it was Professor Yogi Berra who said it's very difficult to get data about the future. Because 6 years later, this was my new hometown. This is the interstate that cuts through Phoenix. Maybe you've driven on it before. We got over 5 inches of rain, which doubled the previous all-time record at the airport. Surprise. So I got out the depth, duration, frequency diagrams, like, well, where does that more than 5 inches of rain fall? So we're gonna be somewhere up in here. This storm event landed right here. 24 hours, a little under 6 inches. And I asked my students, I teach civil engineering, what is the return period on this storm? And you can see that, well, there's lots of return periods plotted out here in different colors, 1 through 1,000. And we are above the 1,000-year storm. They said, Dr. Seeger, there's no return period for that. I said, nonsense. You just need to go further back into the records. When in Ghostbusters, they were saying disaster of biblical proportions. This is what we're talking about, the 2,000-year storm. Of course that's a surprise. Except that's Tucson 9 days later. It's the same precipitation forecast. This type of return period happening in rapid succession in close geographic proximity, maybe you gotta be thinking something about my expectations for the future need to be revised. So Dan has already explained 3 different types of relating to our expectations about the future. The sort of normal variation that is displayed in depth, duration, frequency diagrams, that's kind of probability distribution approach to our expectations about the future. Situational surprise, and in situational surprise, you gotta be thinking, well, perhaps this idea of risk characterization, that I can approach the future probabilistically, that I can characterize that PDF, the probability distribution function, and make expectations about how the dice in the future roll. Perhaps it needs some revision. Perhaps my models need updating, the parameters need updating, the PDFs need updating, because I'm no longer experiencing what the old models would expect. But there's the more fundamental level of surprise. You never bought the lottery ticket and yet you won. The things that happened that you never thought were possible. And here, in situational surprise, you need a fundamental reconception of your understanding of the world. That is, your mental model is not miscalibrated, it is broken. You need a new way to think about the future because everything that you're doing in the old way is just making things worse. Okay, so we have these 3 categories, and normal variation is already well covered by decades of research in risk analysis and risk characterization. Situational surprise is something that, for example, the Army Corps is waking up to. People who are working in hurricanes and storms and these depth, duration, frequency diagrams are saying, oh, wait a minute, I think we're a bit out of date. As climate becomes less predictable, we need to be more up to date on our distributions, but fundamental surprise remains a problem. Is there at least 5 sources of that type of surprise? The first one is, well, the PDFs weren't wrong by a little, they were wrong by a lot. And so here we are in the situational surprise. We have an idea, which I've represented here in purple, a misconception about the world, and it can be corrected with further experience with reality. All right. A more fundamental type of surprise is what I've called erroneous extrapolation. Very difficult to get data about the future, so typically what we do is we extrapolate the past. And we're very good at linear extrapolation. Our intuitions on linear extrapolation are excellent, which is why we can teach fractions in 3rd grade, you know? But nonlinear extrapolation, we stink. Log linear extrapolation, we stink. Our intuitions fail when extrapolation becomes nonlinear. So there's another way of situational and fundamental surprise. 3 more coming up. Hidden mechanisms and constraints. We have an idea that the system works in a certain way. And so I've drawn this network diagram, cause, effect, influence, but the reality is that certain nodes are connected, or there are influences that we overlooked, we didn't understand. So hidden mechanisms and constraints is another source of surprise, and then these two are more interpersonal. On this hand, you thought we were all on the same team, and the fact is we're working at different purposes. We are expecting people to behave in a certain way. People are the most unpredictable of all of these types of things. I'd much rather be a meteorologist than a psychologist, you know. But in fact, people are doing different things because they're operating under incentive structures that we didn't understand. So I call that empathetic failures, where we're unable to take other people's perspective and then they surprise us. And lastly, the most difficult perspective to take is sometimes the one of ourselves. So here, I've called it lack of self-awareness, to be polite. Another way to put it might be denial. And sometimes that denial is willful. So all of these things can be sources of surprise. The challenge for us, because surprise is inevitable, is to prepare people to better function, adapt, respond to surprise. It's not just a question of, well, there's a storm coming through and it's bigger than we thought. There will be fundamental misconceptions that are revealed by these extreme experiences. How do we train infrastructure managers and people in general to respond more effectively when they are confronted with these types of situational and fundamental surprises? Well, there are a number of ways. So I've taken the same graph, the normal variation, situational, and surprise, laid it out on the x-axis so that you can understand increasing complexity as we move to the right. And hypothetically, I mean, we would love to have training exercises that are inexpensive and safe to run that help people gain experience with surprise. I've listed a number of these along this yellow line to show that they increase in complexity as I'm going to reveal you to them, and the cost of them increases as we go up and to the right. The first one, the models. The difficulty with models is getting all the parameters right. But then once you have a model parameters, well, you can explore a lot of uncertainties. You can do some sensitivity analyses and that kind of thing. As soon as you open up your model to other people, non-expert users, the ones who didn't develop the model, you can create a simulation. They get to interact with the model, and the model becomes a simulation. We can, if the simulation is promising, create exercises. We're going to try it. We're going to go out into the real world, and we're going to release we're going to simulate a dam breach upstream in the watershed of study to see how the rest of the system responds. It's getting very expensive. It requires a lot of participation. There could be unintended or surprising consequences, which is kind of the whole point, but you get to run an exercise under controlled circumstances and say, let's see whether our expectations conform with our experience. And then finally, you can create live events. You can create real surprises. And in this live event, you can understand why people are so reluctant to do it. Because when you're confronted with that type of surprise, you debilitate your own organization. It has certain short-term costs for uncertain longer-term benefits. But I've let this gap right in here because that's what we think is going to be the sweet spot for us. It's a game. The models inform the experts. When we turn them over to the users, it might be the pilot doing a flight simulation, they get to test the models for different sensitivities. But the game is when people become emotionally invested in the outcome. When you become emotionally invested in the outcome, it's no longer a simulation, it's a game. People are playing for that. It's voluntary. I mean, they could quit because this is play, but they're invested in the score, in the hierarchy, in the relationships. And so you add things like leaderboards, and you've probably seen your kids that have this all on their phones. The game mechanics that motivate people to become invested. The big question that we are at this stage is, can we create a game environment that simulates surprise, that surprises people?